Hello, and welcome to Character Class. We're back again. That's right. Um, this week I'd like to talk to you about 5 tips for for GMs who want to start their own campaign. Now, I'm going to be getting into this in a little bit, but before I do that, I just want to make mention that the 5 tips that I had for new GMs last week apply to this as well. So naturally, you want to read the manual. You want to. You don't have to do everything yourself. As I said, you establish clear communication between you and your players. Don't be afraid to say no, and be consistent and fair in your rulings and how you do things. This is what you want to do. You want to get all that done and be ready. But for starting a new campaign, that can be daunting. And whether you're trying to just come up with something like a small story that's going to take place over a little bit, or whether you're going for a big overarching campaign that's going to last for a couple years worth of playing. That's up to you. All of these tips that I'm going to be given apply to all of those. You don't have to worry because these are very, very general tips. Um, First and foremost, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to pick your scope. That is the first thing you want to do. You want to take and sit down and go, all right, do I want to tell a big story? Or do I want to tell a small story? Do I want to tell the story of the entire world or the player characters in their journeys across an entire world, fighting this big bad guy who's like so overpowered they need to slowly work their way up? You know, like the usual fantasy tropes. Do you want to tell something that big, or do you want to go and get a much smaller scope of a story where you tell the story of the player characters in a smaller area, like a kingdom, and their efforts to protect this kingdom and do things and ensure that it's running well, their rise to power in the area, whatever you want to do. But you're going to want to have that down. You're going to want to figure out what that scope is, what the breadth of your story, your campaign that you're going to do. Do you just want to have them exploring a bunch of dungeons for a series of dungeon crawls, one after the other, to complete some arbitrary quest, or possibly not an arbitrary quest? Maybe it's tied into one of the characters' backstories. Doesn't really matter. But you want to get that scope down. You want to know what you're doing. You want to know how big you're going to make it ahead of time. Because once you kind of have a general idea as to how big you want to make it, then you can work on filling in all the blanks. And that's where number 2 comes in. My second little tip. It's kind of tied together with number 1. You want to pick your setting. Now, usually people are going to know what the setting is going to be before they know what the scope of the campaign is going to be. Because usually it's, well, do you want to play a D&D game? Do you want to play Vampire the Masquerade? Any of the World of Darkness? Do you want to play a Shadowrun? Do you want to play, what other games are there? Deadlands, The Wheel of Time, The Chronicles of Amber, Diceless role-playing game. What do you want to play? What's your system going into it? So you're going to know your system, which helps define your setting. Um, Once you know your system, uh, you go in and, like, for example, we'll say Dungeons and Dragons. So you know your system. You know it's going to be Dungeons and Dragons. You know what edition you're going to be playing. So then you start looking at campaign settings, because you've got Greyhawk, you've got Forgotten Realms, you've got Ravenloft. There's a whole bunch out there that can be done. You're playing in the World of Darkness. That can be any modern day city. You can make up your own to throw into some country somewhere, or you can pick an actual city. Usually for me, because I'm currently living there, I tend to go for Calgary when I'm doing my World of Darkness settings. Um, Having fun with finding real life monuments and fun little places to add in. It's always interesting. So you want to do that. You want to get that the setting put down so you know. Once you know where you're setting it, what the world is, because once you know your setting, you know your world, you know what's going to be happening, you know what sort of creatures you're going to want to have it there, so on and so forth. Now, if you're building your own, if you're a new GM and you're just starting out on campaigns, I would not advise building your own uh, campaign setting. I would not advise it. Play in some other people's that have already done the work for you. As I said, you don't have to do everything yourself. There's plenty of campaign settings out there that you can get your hands on, which will let you know what sort of creatures, what sort of magic, what sort of anything is going to be involved in it. So you can get all that done, get it down, and basically save yourself some trouble as well as get yourself accustomed to how things work. So when you actually get around to building your own, you've got a good framework in your mind uh, to know how to do this, to know what to include, what not to include, what you need to think about when you're setting things up for yourself. Um, I may end up doing a more specific character class sometime here in the foreseeable future, possibly on world building, which helps in setting up your own campaign, which would deal with a lot more of the specific things going into this. But for now, we're keeping things nice and simple, nice and broad strokes. Now, the next thing you're going to want to do, and this is one of the more important things, not the most, but one of the more important, you're going to want to outline your story, which is basically outlining your campaign. Because as a GM, DM, storyteller, whatever you are, you're going to want to know what you want to do with the characters, what you want to do with the NPCs. You're going to want to have a very vague, broad strokes outline where this is how the PCs get introduced. These are some of the big main events I want to happen in this story. These are going to be some of the NPCs that are going to be interacting with player characters. These are their motivations. Get this all down. You don't have to go into super detail. It's actually better to not go into super detail, I find. But you can if you want. Just make sure you've got wiggle room, and that'll be coming with in a couple of tips here, because I'll explain when I get there. But yeah, you want to get that story outlined. You want to know generally the direction that the party's going to be going into. Um, you're going to want to know what you're aiming for in your story, so that you don't have to worry. You've got it outlined. As I said, don't bother filling it in, um, but you want to know what that general direction is, so that when you're having to think on your feet and pull things out of thin air for them to encounter, um, you can make sure that it's going to guide that storyline along. Now, I'm not perfect. I'm not, the best storyteller out there. Absolutely not. But I like to think I know a thing or two. So you want to get that outline there. You want to get it written down so that you know generally what your beginning, your middle, and your end is in your story. Anything else you can fill in along the way. And that's usually where things get really fun and interesting, is when you're filling in things along the way. So that you want to do. You want to get that down. Then you have the fourth tip that I've got. Pardon me. The fourth tip is to get your house rules set down. Now, for those of you who are unaware, as brand new GMs and storytellers, there are often things called house rules, because there are often rules in the books that are either a little broken and never got fixed, or they simply don't work with what setting you're going in, or you don't find them to be effective and you want to run things a little differently. Um, you're generally going to come across this the more experienced you get, where you're going to come up with these house rules. There's several different variants, several ways of going about it. Depending on your system, depending on what you're doing, there's going to be some interesting house rules that'll do some fun things. I myself find that in the world of darkness, there are certain house rules that uh, end up coming up more often than not. Um, one of which that I have been doing with my current campaign that I'm running in Mage is I borrowed, because we are running second edition, we're not running the 20th, but some of the things that are introduced in 20th I really like, and I introduced it into mine as a house rule, such as the dodge uh, trait. It's a, what is it? A skill? No, a talent. The dodge talent um, on the Mage 20 sheets has been replaced with athletics, which was already there to begin with. So now it's just one thing that covers both instead of having two separate one athletic skill for this and one dodge skill for something else. It's both covered under one. It's a nice little house rule to help streamline things, and that's usually what house rules are for. Other times, house rules are a little different and not meant to streamline things or not meant to do anything. You just find that they make more sense. When I run vampire campaigns in Vampire the Masquerade, I tend to not have not have any of the physical traits be able to be raised um, once you become a vampire. You can't spend experience on them to raise your physical traits like strength, dexterity, stamina because you're vampires, you're static. You can't increase your muscle mass. You can't, increase your strength or anything like that simply by working out. What you can do is spend blood points to buff all of those. So, because that's a mechanic already built in, I just say you can't spend experience on those three physicals. Um, you also can't spend it on appearance because it's a physical thing that's static. Your manipulation, charisma, you can spend experience on, and your perception, intelligence, and wits, you can spend experience on, but none of the physicals uh, can be raised up by experience. So that's some of the things that are interesting. And because appearance is tied into a couple of the clans in terms of beauty, it's also one of the ones that ends up falling under that. So those are examples of house rules. And if you're new, you may not want to have any house rules, which is fine. You don't have to. Uh, but if you are new to a GM and are working on a campaign, and you've had a few thoughts on things that you might want to change, rules that you might want to change. There's nothing wrong with that. Go right ahead. Um, just make sure, again, you communicate with your players so that they know that you're doing this, so that it's not going to be, something that you're pulling out of left field. Let them know before you even begin your campaign. And these are my house rules. These are how I run things in this game. Usually, most players will not have a problem with that. Sometimes they will, uh, and I may end up doing an episode on dealing with problem players as well in the future because that's something that should be should definitely be addressed because they are out there. But usually most people won't have a problem with you saying, this is how I'm running things for this campaign. These are my house rules. This is the way things are. I know it's different from the book, but that's okay. That's just how we're running it. Um, I myself play in a campaign run by one of my players, um, and he runs things differently than I do. But we don't uh, we don't cause problems for each other. We just accept that's the way it is. You're playing in this person's campaign, so you got to go by their rules. It's the way it works. Most players will understand that. Now, on to the last. One of the most important rules, something that I have personally learned from experience, is to avoid being linear. Now, what I mean by that is, uh, prime example, uh, I created a campaign many, many years ago where I had quite a lot down. I'd spent weeks and weeks preparing, getting the story arc laid down that this was going to happen, then this was going to happen, then this was going to happen, and things were going to proceed along a nice direct route for the players. It didn't give them it wasn't giving the players much room to maneuver around, much room to do their own thing. Um, and when we started the campaign, almost immediately they ended up doing something that I was not expecting and didn't plan for, and it ended up causing about 7 to 10 pages worth of stuff that I'd written, encounters that were going to happen later on, to simply be null and void because they'd already done it. They'd skipped right to the end in like the first part of it and basically caused a lot of chaos and mess. And that is what players are best at. They will cause chaos and mess and trouble for the GM. So the more linear your campaign is, the worse off that's going to be, and that's going to make you feel pretty bad. So you want to avoid that. If you take any of these tips to heart, avoid being linear in the creation of your campaign. As I said, use your broad outline for a story. Get that down, that's fine. You know the beginning, the middle, and the end. But do not put it down in stone. Only write it in pencil so that if something happens a third of the way through your campaign, 2/3 of the way through, at any point, if something happens and you get an idea where you're like, you know, I could use this event and have it tie into something towards later in the end. And then you have to, but in order to do that, you'd have to rewrite that ending. Rewrite the ending. It's fine. You don't want to be too beholden to your own story. You don't want to grip on it with a death grip and never let it go and railroad the players down the path you want them to go. You're there to tell the story, absolutely. You're there to craft the narrative and entertain your players, but the players are there to entertain you as well. So let them have that free reign. Let them run around and do things out of the ordinary. Let them wander off the beaten path that you want them to walk down because you can come up with interesting things. Um, Prepare ahead of time as well. Have those have like weird, strange things that you may want to happen to the players. Write them down when you're doing your outline off to the side. It's like just random encounters that you could seed in at any point if it's feasible. That way, you always have these little things that you can just be like, oh, they're doing something that I'm not expecting. I'll just drop this in here and give us something to do while I think of how to get them back on the path. So always give yourself that leeway, that wiggle room to maneuver around. Uh, never rely on linear stories unless your players want that. There are some playing groups out there, I'm sure, that like following a story, uh, picking up all the breadcrumbs that you as the storyteller want to spread out and lead them down the garden path. So if that's the way your playing group is, by all means, feel free to ignore this tip about not being linear. But yes, definitely, definitely these are some little tips I think that can help you. Most of all, what basically all 5 of these tips are saying is that you want to take the time, put in the effort towards doing it, put in the effort to build your campaign, to get it set up, to know what you're doing. You should, on average, have at least 2 to 3 playing sessions worth of material ahead of time. That way, in case something happens a lot quicker than it should, you're prepared with what's to go next. And if something is slower, then you're even more ahead of the game. Um, so yeah, you want to put in that effort. You want to be prepared for your players. You want to have the campaign really firmly in your mind, um, at least where you want them to go, that general direction, not specifics. Uh, to avoid that linearity, you want to do that. So that's pretty much it. I'm doing a lot of repeating of the points, so I'm going to call this episode here. As always, if you like what I'm doing, please give that like button a tap. Give that subscribe button a tap as well if you haven't already, so you can be kept apprised of when I do new videos. and throw a comment in the comment section. Um, if you like my tips, if you have any ideas for new episodes that I should be doing, other than the ones that I've already mentioned. And I've got a few more ideas rattling around in my head because I've done an episode on Vampire the Masquerade playing, so I'm going to be doing one for Werewolf and Mage and Changeling and Wraith, and possibly even Hunter and Demon. Even though I don't know those ones very well, I may have to ask a few people. I'm definitely going to be asking a few of my friends for help on the Werewolf and the Changeling because I'm not 100% on those particular systems. I don't feel educated enough to actually offer those tips. So do all that, and until next time, keep studying and keep playing games.